Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by BASF.
I'm Brittany Warner with RealAgriculture.com. Thanks again for tuning into another Pulse School episode. Today I have Mike Palmier from MaxAg Consulting, and today we're going to be talking about root rot. Now, Mike, what's the ideal window to begin scouting for root rot?
Well, I'd say really any time between emergence and through flowering, but what you really should look to focus at is periods of stress on the plant where it gives the root rot or pathogens an opening to infect the plant. So, after heavy rainfall, maybe there's a little bit of water sitting in some low spots, or after you spray your herbicide, right, which will stress that plant out for a period of time. Those types of incidents throughout the year will definitely give openings for the root rots to potentially take over. So the key then is to make sure that you dig up that plant and check out the roots. Even if you're not seeing visual symptoms above the ground, the roots will give you an idea on what the future of the above ground matter will be.
Now, how can we determine which root rot that we're dealing with based on the symptoms, and kind of what are those symptoms? Right.
So, I mean, they all have slightly different symptomology and are more prevalent in different conditions, right? Like a pythium would be more prevalent in cooler, wet soils, while Fusarium is a little bit different. Like typically where I see Fusarium, because Fusarium transfers over many different crop species, is in situations where, let's say, there was some baling going on in that field where there's straw that's left on top of the surface, or maybe poor straw spread from your combine. I typically will find Fusarium root rot in those types of areas, and what you're looking for in that specific one is kind of a woody root where it's brown and hardened off around that root, and you will see some yellowing thereafter. While like a pythium or a rhizoctonia are more typically seedling root rots, where you will see that seedling die off and increase your seedling mortality. And if it is above ground, you'll see it on that epicaudal type region or hypocaudal right above that ground surface. Now, when we're talking about probably the most popular root rot at this point, it's the Phanomysis. And with that root rot, really it's quite dependent on moisture, and so it's to choose the right field, have proper drainage within that field, and again, just try to manage your stresses all throughout the year, because potentially, your pathogen levels are maybe just high enough to cause an issue. That little bit of extra stress could cause it to go over the edge. So compaction, right? We talked about drainage, crop rotation, all those really, really matter if you're starting to build up those pathogen levels. Now, talking about crop rotation, obviously you just said that does help. How many years in between, and is there an ideal crop to kind of rotate your pulses off with? Well, it's difficult, right? Because with certain root rots like Fusarium I'd mentioned, I mean, that will transfer over into your cereal crops quite easily. In a Phanomyces, doesn't necessarily work that way. It's mostly a pulse crop disease. And so, I mean, to widen out your rotation, say peas are slightly more sensitive, I found, than lentils in the field. And so ideally we're a 1 in 4 rotation, but if we do have a history of disease, we would look to widen that out further. And it's really important to look at that history. If you had a pea on that field 4 years ago and it was hailed out and had disease issues thereafter, that's a big hot spot, and that's where I see lots of issues is following those types of events. And so if that was the case, I'd really be careful and widen out further. Now, is there anything that farmers can do once they detect it, or once it's there, it's there? Well, I mean, once it's there, but you can lower the spore count by widening out that rotation. Right. As well, I never really mentioned it, but say with a Phanomyces, one way that you can, one method that you can use in order to understand what your risk level is take a soil test of that soil and send it into a seed lab. What are they looking for? Sorry. They're looking for the Phanomyces spores. Right. Okay. Right. So they'll have a general idea on a level where you can move from, say, a medium risk to a high risk. And the key with that is depth of sampling. Right. On those samples, they would prefer that the depth of sample be 4 inches in the ground and below in order to understand that spore level. and it just gives you an idea on your risk tolerance on that field to potentially, understand where you should put that pulse and where you should widen out the rotation further.
Now, should people be doing multiple soil samples per field to get an idea, or is one enough, kind of get a broad overall understanding?
If you're tested for a Phanomysis, your spore levels are going to be the highest on the wettest areas.
Right.
And so, maybe you don't necessarily go in a flooded out depression, but try to go just outside of that. A lower toe slope area would be the best spot to sample for that.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us today, Mike.
Thanks.